Yeah. Okay. There you go. Okay. Yeah, so this is like welcome to one of my online Long Beach State classes where I completely forget and then have to awkwardly start recording in the middle of the lecture. Anyway, um, yeah, so without going into detail, if you know who this individual is, I have a show of hands. How many of you have heard of Shabtai Zviv before? Okay, that's awesome. That's great. That makes me happy. Daryl has, and that doesn't surprise me. Okay, so really quick, the images in the background, there's nothing particularly special about them. That says Echa, which is the Book of Lamentations, which is significant in the sense that it's out of a event of lamentation that the what's called the Sabbatean movement arises. But what's more significant than that is that this is printed on a page. So this movement emerges out of the print revolution of the 15th and 16th centuries. So the Protestant Reformation, the printing press, Gutenberg, all of that stuff that you learned about in history class when you were younger, this has a role to play in Jewish history as well. And it's out of that comes this really fascinating movement that's referred to as Sabbateanism, or the movement of this Messiah, Shabtai Zvi, who, again, one of the more negatively influential figures in Jewish history. Okay. Oh, forward here. There we go. Now I want to sort of step back even a little bit further than the 17th century when the Sabbatean movement arises. I want to step back into the late 13th century, a couple hundred years earlier, beginning with the expulsion from England. So very quickly, if you are, I don't know how familiar everyone is with the expulsions. Most everyone is heard of the Spanish expulsion, which happens in 1492 and corresponds with, what is that? Let me close that. Go away, you. There we go. And it does correspond with with Spain kicking off the colonial period. There's no accident there. Both of those go hand in hand. But really, the expulsions of Jews from European countries, there's a very specific time frame where this happens, and it happens over the course of about 150, maybe 200 years, beginning with the expulsion from England, where the Jews of England are expelled by Edward I and are not allowed back in until I want to say the reign of Charles I. It's significantly later. It's like 300 years. There are none of us in England, and that kicks off a series of expulsions. There's a few that happened before that, but the big ones happen starting with the English expulsion, and it ultimately culminates with the expulsions from Spain and Portugal. And the reason I bring this up is because these expulsions were massively traumatic. You know, we talk about it there's a passage in the Siddur before we say Kaddish. We talk about these sort of traumas that have happened. And we think about it in a historical sense, but we tend to be more preoccupied with the Shoah and with subsequent pogroms and that sort of thing. We don't think about the expulsions as often. One of the reasons for that is because the expulsions from Spain happened primarily to Sephardi Jews rather than Ashkenazi Jews, and that doesn't mean it doesn't affect Ashkenazi Jews. It just means that it doesn't mean necessarily as large. But the reality is that the expulsions were so massively traumatic and constitute such a massive upheaval that it was unavoidable that Judaism would massively change as a result, like significantly change. I see other participants on there. When I'm running my own tech today, so if you are online, my request to you is if you have a question, just shout it out. Oh, never mind, Sarah, you're amazing. Sarah's on top of it. Can you come help me teach my class at Long Beach? I will hire you. Yeah, right? Okay. So these upheavals were so traumatic that they're going to massively affect the entire trajectory, not just of Jewish history, but of Jewish culture as well. And the Sabbatean movement, or the Messianism of Shabtai Zvi, comes out of these upheavals. We can't look at one without understanding the other. And of course, what happens in Spain doesn't just affect like the Jews of Europe. Spain will use the property and money that they confiscate from the Jews and Muslims who they expel in order to conquer Mexico, right? So the entire colonial period comes as a result of these expulsions. All right. What interesting thing that happens is Jewish identity then goes into a period of flux. And I don't just mean changes necessarily to our theology or changes to historical events. I mean the way that we as Jews in different parts of Europe and other parts of the world, the way that we think about ourselves, for the vast majority of us, both Sephardim and Ashkenazim, goes into this weird state of change. So and it leads to what scholars call a period of what we might call religious fluidity. So oftentimes when you hear the term fluid appear today as addresses identity, you hear it oftentimes in discourse about gender, right? Gender fluidity and that sort of thing. When we look at accounts from this period, particularly among Jews in the Mediterranean, but also among some other people as well, among Christians and Muslims to a certain degree as well, you see a similar sort of fluidity among religious identity, an ability to flip and switch religions depending on one's social context, and not in a sinister or a self-serving way, except to say if one looks at survival as a type of self-serving mechanism, but just basically to survive. If you are expelled from Spain for being Jewish and you need to make it in Portugal or make it in Italy, then you need to be Christian. And if then you're going to go across the Mediterranean and you need to make it in North Africa or in other parts of the Ottoman world, you're going to have to be Muslim. It serves you a little better. And then if you want to come back, right, if you want to deal with the Inquisition, you have to become Christian again. And so we see lots of accounts of Jews throughout the Mediterranean flipping back and forth between identities. And in some instances, fully converting to Roman Catholicism in particular. And so today we hear stories of people who say, oh, my grandmother always lit candles on Shabbat, but we're super Roman Catholics, right? Because they, at least in their family narrative, they have this history of connection to the conversos, to those Jews who were expelled from Spain and then lost their Judaism. So this is what happens in the Mediterranean. What happens in the rest of Europe among the Ashkenazim is something a little bit different. There isn't a major movement among the Ashkenazim of Europe to become Christian. They don't become Christian, but what happens is that new religious movements emerge. So the Sabbatean movement, and then later what's called the Frankish movement, and these develop new sorts of Jewish identities. Over the next couple hundred years, especially as some of these new religious movements recede into the background, other types of new religious movements that we don't think of as new religious movements, namely the Reform movement and the Hasidic movements, these also will emerge as well. And all of these come about because of the upheaval that's wrought upon both the Spanish and North African Jewish communities and then the European Jewish communities as well. All right. So, and oftentimes this is in response to persistent anti-Semitism. That's really what it comes down to in both cases, the Spanish and Portuguese expulsions, and then the immense series of pogroms that happened throughout Europe, especially at this point in Eastern Europe. Questions so far?
Was there a big African and Jewish population?
Oh, North Africa. So yes, you have what are called, there are what are sometimes referred to as Maghrebi Jews, which are like Jews who are indigenous for the most part to like Morocco and other parts of North Africa, and then you have Sephardi refugees from Spain. Yeah. All right. So I just want to put a little more context of more context behind this upheaval. The expulsion we talked about, but also at the same time, throughout all of Europe, culture is changing. So it's not just the expulsion of Jews from Europe. You also have huge changes to the Christian power structure as well, and the dominant European culture. So that means the Protestant Reformation, right? This major schism within Christianity, which results in its own sort of violence, like between Protestants and Catholics throughout Europe. You have, but also Protestants, things don't necessarily get better for Jews because of Protestants. Martin Luther, who initially is very interested in saying, okay, the Catholic Church has been terrible to y'all, Protestants have your back, because we did not convert to Protestantism, to Lutheranism, he immediately turned on us and instigated a series of pogroms against German Jewish communities. He wrote a book called On the Jews and Their Lies, which would go on to influence the Nazis. And this is like, this would add to the upheaval. So initially, where most of the violence against Jewish communities were happening in Catholic regions, and for a while, it seemed like there may be a reprieve in the Protestant regions, that quickly gets turned on its head. And Protestantism in Europe ends up being just as violent towards Jewish communities as the Catholics were. The only saving grace, if you want to call it that, is that they were also preoccupied with killing Catholics, and Catholics were preoccupied with killing Protestants. And this was what was going on at the time. But in addition to these, you have these other geographical and geopolitical and social changes. Literacy is increasing exponentially among both Jews and Christians. And I should say, when I say Jews were always very literate because we study Talmud and Torah, but because of the printing press, Jews now have access to secular and Christian materials, or scientific materials, or philosophical materials that we have not had since the Hellenic period, right? Since the classical Greek period. That was the last time we had this sort of access. And so this is changing the way Jews think about themselves. We're encountering Enlightenment ideas. And so the seeds will be planted also for later developments like the Haskalah, which is the Jewish Enlightenment. So I mentioned this Christian sectarianism. There's this ongoing sort of this ratcheting up of tension with the Ottoman Empire. It begins with this thing called Turkeri, which means a fascination with Turkish culture, but that very quickly turns into an animosity towards Turkish culture. And so there's increasing skirmishes between Christian Europe and the Muslim Ottoman Empire. And then finally, at the same time that this is happening, the exact same time, Europe is colonizing the New World. Right. So this is what's happening in the world. And so you could see why there's so much upheaval, why this is going to lead to new religious movements. It certainly happens with Christians, right? It happens with Protestantism. We don't think of Lutheranism as a new religious movement anymore, but at the time it very, very, very much was. And what's also happening at the time is people are talking about this being the end of the world, because it is the end of the world. It's the end of the world as they know it. Like, not to, I think I just quoted an REM song. Yeah. That was not intentional. But yeah, it's the end of what they understand as the world. Daryl.
There seems to be a remnant, not the extremes we're talking here. But I know a number of times I had to go to a funeral being Jewish, and I don't care. It was a church, Catholic, whatever, no big deal. But the guy who was Lutheran was sweating the fact he had to go into a Catholic church. The Methodist guy was worried when he had to go into a Lutheran church. And I'm looking, these guys says, it's all the same to me.
Yep. Yeah, because there's still a lot of that sort of like earlier European baggage. Absolutely. So we can look at sort of, there's four main agents of change that will affect Jewish culture, that will change Jewish culture as we know it, and actually lead to Jewish culture as we understand it today. Like, we as Reformed Jews exist as Reformed Jews, not as Jews, but as Reformed Jews, because of these events that are happening. So the first thing is millennialism. It's this notion that the world is changing or ending, or an apocalypse is going to happen in the original Greek sense, meaning the veil is going to be lifted and God is going to work God's wonders in the world through the Messiah. And it's not just Jews who are feeling this. Christians are feeling this as well. There are Christians who think that Lutheranism and Protestantism is going to bring about the second coming of Jesus. And there are Christians who think that Luther is the Antichrist. And then there's Protestant Christians who think that the Pope is the Antichrist, and so on and so forth, right? So this millennialism, this idea that this messianic age, which is an idea that is shared in different ways with Jews, Christians, and Muslims, the idea of a messianic age, of a final revelatory working of God's power in the world. This is, all three traditions share this idea, and so this is really emerging significantly because of all the tumult. And out of this, we see these new religious movements like Sabbateanism and the European Enlightenment, and then finally, like I said, the printing press. I jumped ahead of myself, but the printing press is really important because that is what's going to spread all of these ideas and change the world. And it will be the number one agent of communication change in the world until the internet.
Does Christianity believe that the world's coming to an end right now?
Some do, yeah.
Because we were at the pier last Friday night and there had to be
Oh,
500 people out there right before the storm hit us here.
Yeah.
yeah.
Thinking it was the end of the world. They all went out there to the pier to.
Yeah. So folks, so Larry, if you're for you online, if you couldn't hear, Larry asked if millennialism and what's called eschatology or end times theology is a big deal for Christians today. And the answer is, among many of them, yes, it is, particularly in the United States, because we have a long history of this in the US. And also we're in a time of upheaval. And so in times of upheaval, these ideas take hold, and they go hand in hand with changes of communication. So we're in like a perfect storm right now. Not to, I know you mentioned the hurricane last week, but yeah, we're in a perfect storm again, just like during this period in like the 15th century, where you have a new way of communicating with ease, and there are tumultuous social and geopolitical movements, and then people are thinking about the end of the world. So, I mean, you can look at that how you want to look at that. I don't know if that's comforting or not.
But I'm curious, what were they doing there?
It was like a big, they had like a band and, a big Jesus Saves, but a big, I mean, the whole amphitheater there.
The whole pier.
Yeah.
They had people up and down the pier. They wanted to,
No, it was
So-
because, they're passing out
Yeah.
things, you need to be saved, so maybe they were thinking.
So, okay, so the
end.
for those
They
online,
said
the
to me, God bless you. I just looked at him and says, I
Yeah.
didn't sneeze.
It's like, I can't believe you-
for those online right now, the conversation is about these missionaries who were at the pier, and they were having sort of a revival type event. And yeah, so I have a feeling I know which specific groups were there, but basically, yeah, these are evangelical groups that would have been there. Yeah, we're good, thanks. And yeah, that's they were using the hurricane, the incoming or tropical storm, as sort of drama to highlight what they see as the coming storm, the end of the world. All right. So moving back to what we're talking about, what are some of the foundations of this movement, this new religious movement? Today, people would call it a cult, right? We refer to it today as Sabbateanism. What were the foundations of it? So the first is what's called mysticism under a man named Isaac Luria and the Sfat Circle, or Safed Sfat. Sfat is a city in Israel. It's on the coast. It's still known today as being a center of mysticism, of Jewish mysticism. Today, that means Hasidic Judaism primarily. And so there are numbers of Hasidic mystics who live in Sfat and engage in various forms of mysticism. And it's been this way since you had this rabbi named Isaac Luria, I want to say in the 13th century, who essentially, he compiled the Zohar. I think he was behind the Zohar. I forget exactly, but I know he was one of the, no, that was someone else, excuse me. No, so Luria, what was significant about Luria is he comes up with the idea of Tikkun Olam. So what we think of today as Tikkun Olam, actually, let me ask you, what does Tikkun Olam mean? Repairing the world. We all know that Tikkun Olam has become a central pillar of Reform Jewish thought, particularly in the United States. But what does repairing the world mean from a Reform perspective? When we use it, what do we mean? Yeah, mitzvahs and volunteering, right? Exactly. That's exactly how we conceive of this. Was Luria understood it, and as later mystics understood it, and even many Hasidic Jews today understood it, is that when God creates the world, God chooses to shatter a portion of God's self and spread these shards or these sparks throughout the world. And because of this shattering of the Godhead, of the figurehead of God, because of this shattering, the world is a messed up place. And in order to repair, to engage in tikkun olam, to repair the world, Jews have to connect to God by any means possible. So that doesn't mean engaging in social justice during this period. What that means is studying Torah and studying Kabbalah and becoming a mystic. And so that's what Luria is doing. And this type of mysticism will end up affecting the Sabbatean movement and then later Jewish movements as well. The other thing that's happening is a strong resurgence of Jewish messianism that really had not been felt even during the Crusades, this had not been felt since the 1st century, when the last big Messiah was Bar Kokhba, who gets destroyed by the Romans, and then 100 years before that, when it's Jesus, right? So because of all the anti-Semitism, because of the expulsions, because of some really horrendous pogroms, one of which I'll talk about in a moment, you have this yearning for the Messiah. So this desire for the Messiah to return comes back, and most Jews are like seriously praying for this event to happen. And one of the things that they'll begin doing, especially amongst Sephardim, but even some Ashkenazi immigrants who moved to Sfat, they'll begin practicing mysticism to bring about this coming of the Messiah. So tikkun in this context means repair, but it specifically means bringing balance to the universe. Because when the universe is in balance, and yes, it does mean balance in that Eastern sense, because Jewish Kabbalah was probably influenced by Sufism, which was definitely influenced by like Hindu mysticisms. So there's a line of connection there. But so essentially literally means in this sense means bringing balance to the universe, and balance to the universe happens by bringing about the Messiah. But the only way we can bring about the Messiah is by being connected to God, to Hashem. Some Hasidim still believe this today. One of the reasons why you'll see Chabad rabbis going around asking you if you want, if you're a man, if you want to like lay tefillin, or if you want to shake the lulav or something like that during Sukkot. The reason they do that is not just to engage in Jewish outreach, although that is legitimately part of it. It's because there's a belief that if every Jew over a series of lifetimes, if you want to get really mystical here, we're talking about a type of reincarnation. Oh, if every Jew always over a series of lifetimes performs every single mitzvah in the Torah, then at that point the Messiah will return. Yeah. So it's very, very, very mystical. And this type of mysticism emerges initially during this period. Daryl, go ahead.
It's interesting because I remember at the Israel Fair at the fairgrounds, God, that goes back a long time ago. This Chabad rabbi wrapped all the stuff on me, and to me, I just because I wanted the experience. When I got done, this guy had a look, and I just made his next month. I just made it.
Yeah, because he would have seen it as what's called like he would have seen it as he would have picked up a tiny shard of God's essence and repaired the world in a very physical, real sense, right? So of course he would have felt that way, but also he did help a Jew out, and that's part of it too.
But I wasn't
Right.
just as excited as he was.
So moving on to continue talking, I want to get to Shabtai Zvi himself, but in order to do that, we have to look at this particularly horrendous pogrom that happens in Ukraine and Russia and parts of Poland. So it's referred to as the Khmelnytsky pogrom. I'm not going to read through all of this. I'm just sort of going to go over it a little bit. You had a brief period in Poland, Ukraine, and the Pale of Settlement where, yeah, there was violence and there was persecution, but not in this huge, immense way. So this individual named Bogdan Khmelnytsky, he's a Ukrainian Cossack. He really turns it all on its head. Essentially, his beef was with Polish authorities, but Polish authorities were using like Jewish tax collectors as middlemen. They were using, right? It's God calling right now. Was using basically Jews as middlemen to turn peasants against the Jews rather than against Polish nobility. So that's what's happening. And
It's my neighbor, probably a problem.
oh, okay, yeah, go for it. So what Khmelnytsky does is he basically, classic pogrom, he whips up the peasantry in an anti-Semitic fervor. But what ends up happening is that 50 to 100,000, sorry, my daughter just walked by and they're a very awkward point. 50 to 100,000 Jews are slain in pretty horrendous ways. I'm not going to go into the details. You can look this up if you want to. But the brutality would rival or even exceed that of the Nazis. So that's how, like, the numbers obviously weren't as much, but the brutality was pretty intense. And today, this individual is still revered as a hero in Ukraine and Russia. So without sort of delving into like contemporary issues, the reality is still, like, culturally speaking, he's still revered. But of course, the US, we revere Andrew Jackson. So, but anyway, so he's important because it's out of this, like, so you have these two huge, immense events. You have the Spanish expulsion, and you have in the Mediterranean region and among the Sephardim. And then for the Ashkenazim, you have the Chmielnicki pogrom, which frankly, in terms of the numbers, we're talking about a genocide, right? And the entire Jewish community throughout the world. And at this point, we're talking about there are Jews in India, all the way to what will become New York, right? So in New Amsterdam, because it's owned by the Dutch at this point, but there are Jews living there. So the entire world Jewry is freaking out about what's going on, and won't freak out about this to this degree again until around the Holocaust. And it's out of this that emerges this fellow Shabtai Zvi, and this is an image of him here, a wood cutting, and he, in this crucible, he'll sort of rise as a Messiah, right? And fall as a failed Messiah, but he will become revered and will set himself up, or try to set himself up, as a Messiah. So he's born in Smyrna, which is today it's Izmir in Turkey, in 1626. Middle class merchant family. He's Sephardi. His family would have escaped from Spain. He would have spoken, in addition to speaking Arabic and Hebrew, he would have spoken Ladino. In fact, that comes into play later on, his familiarity with Spanish popular culture at the time. He says that he's born on the 9th of Av. And the 9th of Av commemorates the destruction of the temple. It's a day of mourning. We have started commemorating it here at CBT over the past couple of years, but it traditionally has not been something that Reform Jews have engaged in, because what it is basically it's a 24-hour, 25-hour fast day, similar to Yom Kippur, in mourning for the destruction of the temple by the Romans. He says that he's born on the 9th of Av, and that's intentional. Because whether or not he actually was, if he wasn't born then, he's basically saying that he's the Redeemer, right? He's the one who is either going to bring the Jews back to Jerusalem as the Messiah, or he's the embodiment of the temple itself. So it's only through him comes redemption of the Jewish people. So it was probably that the birthday thing was developed either by him or by one of his supporters later on, and it becomes part of his narrative, part of his mythology. And in 1665, he actually will proclaim himself the Messiah. He says he's the Messiah. He said that it's all, but then some, depending on how, I guess we might say, tragically hilarious things happen in the aftermath of that. So we'll come to that. He has immense appeal throughout the entirety of the Jewish world. Every single Jew would have known who he was at the time, from India to New York or New Amsterdam. Everyone would have known, because so many horrible things were happening that people are saying, what if he is? What if he is the Messiah? What if it's really happening, right? So everyone's going to know who he was, but also because you have this time of upheaval, he actually has appeal among Christians and Muslims as well. That ends up being a problem because for both religions and political structures within those religious traditions, because they cannot have Christians or Muslims leaving Islam or Christianity and joining, essentially becoming Jews, right? That's the concern. And there's going to be pushback as a result of that. Printing contributes to his mass appeal. One of the things that makes him so popular is that people find out who he is. He's not localized. His word is spread quickly, very quickly, throughout the continent and throughout the world. Even quicker than happened with Jesus. With Jesus, it happens 100 years later, or not 100, that happens like 40 years later, by Paul, who's intentionally writing letters and taking them to different churches. In this case, you print it, you give it to someone, and they run it somewhere else, right? So that's how, just like everything else at the time, like all other Enlightenment texts, the same thing's happening with his texts. His early life really reflects that of a religious founder. He's very learned when it comes to Torah. He knows his Torah. He knows Talmud. He's mystically inclined, although that would have been sort of normal for Sephardim who lived on the Eastern Mediterranean, close to Sfat. They would have been familiar with mysticism. But he's also sort of aloof. He probably suffered from some sort of mental illness. But that's something that we often see with religious founders. So so he fits that mold as well. In fact, he specifically, scholars today look back and they say that he shows evidence of bipolar disorder specifically, and he has these alternating periods of euphoria and dysphoria. So what will happen is when he's probably in what today we would call a manic episode, he has what he calls his illuminations, where the Hester Panim, or the hidden face of God, like that's how it's described in the book of Esther. The hidden face of God reveals itself, right? There's a lifting of the veil, and he gets to see what God wants, right? So he has these episodes where he is communing with God. Today, as the way it's written, historians and psychologists look at this and say the way that he describes this, it sounds like a manic episode of someone who has bipolar disorder. But at the time, what he's saying is that these are prophecies, and that's what people will end up saying about him. But then he goes into these periods of dysphoria where he engaged in what he calls ma'azim zarim, or strange actions. Strange actions meaning things that are anti-halakhic, things that are destructive, or just these periods of withdrawal and depression. One of the things that he does, though, is he's very cavalier about this. He casually pronounces the name of God, right? Yud He Vav He. I wrote it how it might have been pronounced. I wrote it up there. But that he just goes out and says it, right? Now today, when I'm teaching this in my class, when I'm teaching about like the ancient Israelites, I might say the name, but at the time, nobody does that. And even right now, you see, I'm not saying it. I'm reluctant to do that. But he just throws it out there, right? Just, he sounds like a cultural atheist on Reddit, the way he throws it out there. He has marital issues. Namely, he is unable to consummate his marriages. He gets married 3 times. Each time the marriages are not consummated for whatever reason that is. It probably had more to do with his mental state than any sort of gender or sexual identity issue. It probably just had to do with his what was probably bipolar disorder. But he has a series of marriage issues, and after the second one, that's when he goes through like this series of wandering, or he falls into this state where he makes these claims about being God, and he engages in bizarre behaviors. I think he takes an axe to the synagogue of Smyrna, or one of the synagogues. He engages in antinomianism, which means arguing that the thing that God wants from us is to commit crimes. Right. So, yeah, he says that. So specifically crimes against halacha, against Talmud and Torah, but also like crimes against the Smyrna authorities and the rabbinic authorities, hence bringing an axe to the synagogue gates. And then he's kicked out of Smyrna and he goes in these series of wanderings. And during this time, he increasingly refers to himself as these grandiose titles. He calls himself Torah Katan, which means basically great Torah. He calls himself God. He calls himself Mashiach. He calls himself Messiah. And as he's doing this, he's also having these illuminations and these prophecies, and people begin to follow him. And they say, wow, this guy, they're having a spiritual moment with him. And they think that he's calling himself this, and they think that he actually might be the Messiah. And why not? They don't have anything better right now. Things are bad. So of course they would follow someone like this. And as his following gains more and more supporters, including some noteworthy supporters, more and more people end up joining because they think he's the real deal. He eventually moves to Jerusalem, and he has a period of relative stability. He marries a third wife, a woman who is referred to just by her first name of Sarah. His detractors will say that she's a prostitute. Whether or not that's accurate or not, it's historically unclear. But she definitely wasn't seen as someone who was of high repute. She was definitely frowned upon for whatever reason. But she ends up being one of his strongest supporters and helps organize the movement as well. He moves eventually to Constantinople, and then he moves to Cairo, and then he moves to Gaza. And while he's doing this, he's tinkering with holidays. So what he'll do is he'll say, you know what? We shouldn't be doing in the fall, Sukkot, and then in the spring, Pesach, and then Shavuot in the late spring. We're going to do them all in 1 week. And that's what, so he compresses the holidays into 1 week. He tinkers with the holidays. He tinkers with how they're supposed to be practiced. He engages in what today we would call faith healings. He attempts to heal himself, both physical and mental ailments, but he's not able to do it. He can't do it. He cannot heal himself. He realizes on some level, he realizes that there's something off with him and that he needs help, which is actually, for the time, incredibly sophisticated. Like, he has an awareness that he's sick and that something's not right and that maybe he's not the Messiah. And he takes a period where he tries to seek help for his emotional trouble, and he goes to one of the most revered rabbis of the time. He goes to well, specifically, he would have met him in Sfat, but it's in Gaza where this individual is from, a man named Nathan of Gaza, who was one of the he was very, very prominent, an extremely prominent rabbi who would have been well known throughout Europe and even beyond. And he goes to him for today what we would call psychiatric help. Like, basically, something's wrong with me. I'm not right with God. I'm not right with my family. People are following me. Something's off. Please help me, Rabbi. Tell me what to do. And Nathan of Gaza responds by saying, "You're the Messiah," right? Feeds right into what today we might call his delusions, right? Feeds right into it, says, "You're the Messiah. You're the one we've been waiting for. And I'm going to help spread your word," because Nathan of Gaza had access to a printing press. And so out of Gaza, there are all these pamphlets that Nathan writes, basically creating new types of theology that are based on the illuminations of Shabtai Zvi, based on this antinomianism, the idea of God wanting us to commit crimes against the Torah, changing Judaism in huge, huge ways. And he becomes a prophet for Shabtai Zvi. He calls himself a prophet, and Shabtai Zvi calls him a prophet for him, who, and Shabtai Zvi is now a Messiah, right? And some people would say is God, right? But I don't think he ever, at this point, he's not claiming to be God. He's just claiming to be the Messiah. And Nathan of Gaza, who, again, revered and respected, is saying, yeah, he's the Messiah, and here's all these things that he's saying, and it's all true. And because of that, nobody really stands up to them. Everyone just sort of lets it happen. The rabbis of the world take very little action. Why do you think that's the case? Why would they just let it happen?
I mean, eventually, you've got to realize that he's not going to do anything. If he's supposed to be the Messiah, and then nothing's happening.
Right, but we haven't gotten to that point yet, and it's exactly because of that they don't say anything, because things are awful. And so, if he's not done anything truly destructive, if he's just like taking an axe to one synagogue, then maybe we should just let it play out, because if he's really the Messiah, this is what we need right now. And that's why they let it happen. Yeah, Sherry.
So maybe they're afraid of him.
That's possible. He did well, so that's a good point. Are they afraid of him? To my knowledge in the literature, most rabbis and Jews were not afraid of him, but Christians and Muslims begin to become afraid of him. And we're going to sort of come around to that.
Why didn't Nathan of Gaza say, like, why did he feed into the delusions?
So Hillary asks, for those online, why did Nathan of Gaza feed into the delusions? Somewhere between, because he thought I honestly, personally, I think he thought he was the Messiah. Okay. I think that he convinced Nathan of Gaza. I think Nathan of Gaza, who also has Sephardi ancestry, is seeing what's happening throughout the Jewish world and is like, we need the Messiah now. To quote what the Lubavitchers say, we want Mashiach now. That's what was happening. Yeah, I think that's why. But the thing is like, and so you sort of just hit upon this. The rabbis take little action, but accounts begin to come back to Christian and Muslim leaders. And so a rising anxiety begins among the Ottoman Sultan and among the various Christian leaders of Europe. And this is going to have reverberations both to Shabtai Zvi and beyond. For many, many centuries, Europeans had been, particularly Christian Europeans, had been afraid of this concept, which they call the Red Jews. Now, I know I had never heard this until I started studying about Shabtai Zvi, but you know who the lost tribes are. You've heard of that, right? The lost tribes, the 10 tribes conquered of the northern kingdom of Israel, conquered by the Assyrians, scattered, and they become this sort of mythological force. Like, what happened to these mystical lost tribes? Lots of people claim to be members of the lost tribes. There's lots and lots of discourse about that. That's a whole nother class. Among European Christians who also shared this scripture, they would be like, well, what happened? They imagined that there was this community of powerful Jews that lived somewhere in the Far East. So there was a very Orientalist component to this as well, who were gathering up power and would be led by the Antichrist to enter into Europe. So so the Antichrist would basically lead the 10 lost tribes in to engage in this final battle between good and evil at the time of the apocalypse. This was like a fear among European Christians, not as much among Muslims. But remember that what's happening for it was Shabtai Zvi and Nathan of Gaza. This is happening in Jerusalem and in Gaza and in Sfat. If you're in Paris or Berlin or I don't know, somewhere else in Western Europe, that might as well be the other side of the moon, right? This is a far off, fascinating place. And of course, you would think, well, these are the red Jews, the 10 lost tribes, and either Shabtai Zvi or in this image, Nathan of Gaza, he's supposed to be him right there, are going to lead these armies of angry Jews into Europe to conquer Christendom. So Europeans begin to become, and also Ottomans become increasingly concerned about this. He also starts pissing off, excuse my language, upsetting, he starts upsetting Jewish leaders. So initially Jewish leaders were willing to let it happen. And then his antinomianism and his anti-halacha behavior gets more and more intense for the time. Now, some of the stuff that he does today is like, that's a regular Friday night. Right. But at the time, it was huge and it was considered destructive. So he does the thing with the axe, but then he goes up to read from the Torah and he reads from a Chumash or he reads from a Tanakh, basically. He takes a book rather than the Torah scrolls themselves. And like, if someone were to do that today, you'd be like, well, you probably should have learned your Torah portion, but no one's going to say much of anything, right? If someone takes the vowels in the book up to the bima. But at the time, it was like a major desecration. He calls women to the bima. I think almost every woman in here has been called in an aliyah before, right? This is no big deal. This is no big deal. At the time, it's a huge deal. And so the very patriarchal rabbinic structures of the time are going to be like, this is a major problem. But he plants a seed. So there's a downfall with him, but because of him planting that seed, it will get picked up again during the Haskalah and by the Reform movement. He's the first one to do that. So even though there's all this sort of chaos surrounding this individual, he does plant some historical seeds that will lead to later Jewish movements and things today that we consider to be not just right and proper and just, but also completely normal. Like we don't think twice about it. For instance, calling women up for an aliyah. And then this is like the big like scandal. This is the thing that really like turns people off to him. He canonizes a Castilian love song, a very bawdy and racy Castilian love song. So remember I said he spoke Ladino, he had Spanish ancestry, so he knew this like dirty song. And he canonizes it. He says that it's hiding hidden truths of Torah and hidden truths of the divine and hidden truths of Hashem, just like Hester Panim, the hidden face of God. The hidden face of God is in this filthy song. And he says, not only is this important, the hidden face of God is in it, but it is now a book in the Torah. That's what he does. And like people at this point, people are like, okay, maybe this is not the real deal. But even still, his messianism spreads. And at this point, rabbis are saying, don't follow this guy. But ordinary lay Jews throughout Europe and throughout the Middle East are flocking to him by tens of thousands. They are flocking to him in what is then Ottoman Palestine. And as more and more people flock to him, and as more and more people say that you're the Messiah, and as Nathan of Gaza keeps sending this information out into the world and is telling him that he's the Messiah, and as his wife Sarah is telling him that he's the Messiah, they start to say, okay, you know what? You're the Messiah. You need to put your money where your mouth is. You need to go to the Sultan and you need to demand that Jerusalem and the Holy Land are given back to the Jews. And that's what he does. Now we look at this like with hindsight, and we understand what happened to lead up both towards the War of Independence in 1949 and the 6 Days War and the establishment of the State of Israel and all of that. We know what happened. This hasn't happened yet. So consider the audacity of this individual going up to the Ottoman Sultan at the height of Ottoman power. This is not 1918. This is the height of Ottoman power. And he goes up and he requests a meeting of the Sultan because he's going to say, you need to give Jerusalem and Israel to me and to the Jews. And he goes and he declares his messianic nature, and he requests Jerusalem and Israel to the Grand Vizier. Now, this is interesting. The Sultan sends the Grand Vizier, not him himself, which is like a first sign that maybe things were not going to go great for Shabtai Zvi. And what happens is that he's immediately imprisoned. He's arrested and he's thrown into prison in this Ottoman castle. He's treated with dignity because the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire knows that there are tens of thousands of devoted followers. Not all of them are Jews. Some of them are Muslims, right? Fewer Christians as well. There's tens of thousands of them who see him as the Messiah. And so if he kills Shabtai Zvi, if he beheads him, then he has a serious problem on his hands. He has thousands of angry people that are going to rise up in violence against the Ottoman Empire. So instead, he imprisons him. He treats him with dignity, refuses to ever meet directly, but gives him, after a lengthy time in prison, gives him a counter offer. I'm not going to give you Jerusalem. I'm not going to give you Israel. I'm going to give you your life if you convert to Islam. Convert to Islam or suffer beheading. What do you think he did? Yeah. He converted to Islam. So I mentioned at the beginning of class that I sort of flippantly said that this is the biggest disappointment in Jewish history, alongside certain other bigger disappointments. This is a big one, though, and it was. There is, sometime I would love to talk to you about like the great disappointments that happen when prophecy fails. It raises the question about what happens when prophecy fails. This was one of them. Thousands of people thought he was the Messiah, but didn't just think he was the Messiah. When we talk about whether or not, someone follows an evangelical minister who says the end of the world is coming and, sell all your stuff because the rapture is going to happen in 2 months, right? Which has happened throughout American history. That's definitely a disappointment for those individuals that sort of fall in with that. But that's very different from the entirety of world Judaism. Not everyone followed him, but everyone kind of hoped that he would be the real deal. And you have like centuries of horrendous violence and oppression. This is why he was desired, and it just falls apart. It's a big disappointment. It's a huge disappointment. He doesn't just die, right? He's not beheaded. He's not a martyr. He converts. He throws it all away. And people are just shook to the core. But nevertheless, his closest followers, they follow him. Nathan of Gaza and his wife, they follow him. They also convert to Islam. And a huge number, not at least 1,000 people, so not a huge number, but a large number of his followers say this is what he wants us to do. This is going to help bring about the Messianic age, because by converting to Islam, now Muslims are going to follow Shabtai Zvi. This is what Nathan of Gaza says. Nathan of Gaza starts printing pamphlets saying this is what he wanted to do all along, because now so many Muslims are going to follow Shabtai Zvi. But that's not what happens, because at this point it's like, oh, this guy is this crazy Jewish guy, and it all fell apart, right? But his supporters say that he converts to save his people from violence. His detractors say he converted to save his skin and to seek advancement. It's probably something in between, right? There's some truth in between those two things. But ultimately, the entire Jewish world is left with this immense sense of disappointment. I'm going to I know we have a few minutes left, so I'm going to sort of rush through and finish the story. In the aftermath, we can look at 3 major points of reaction. The first one is the Muslim reaction. So the Ottoman Sultan considers this conversion a triumph for Islam, but also a triumph for the Ottoman Empire. This does entice converts, although not a huge amount, to Islam, but also Ottoman power is not threatened. He successfully dealt with this threat. From an Ottoman perspective, nothing negative happened, right? So Zvi is given a royal appointment. He's given a salary, and he's given a salary to bring in followers, but he ends up practicing this hybrid of Judaism and Islam, and eventually he gets his money taken, he gets his salary taken away from him, and he dies on Yom Kippur, this actually is documented. He does die on Yom Kippur. We don't know about him being born on Av, but he does die on Yom Kippur. He dies in exile, penniless in Albania, right? And he just dies of illness and old age. So a rather ignominious end to this very, very prominent figure. And everyone sort of goes on. When he dies, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what happens with Nathan of Gaza, but I'm going to look that up because now I'm curious. Yeah. The Christian reaction is that the Christian world reacts with ridicule. Like, this is like the funniest thing. They actually make early comic strips detailing the downfall and embarrassment of the Jewish Messiah. In fact, this right here is a French woodcutting, basically saying like Shabtai Zvi, the king of the Jews, and dressing him up as a clown. Right? They're saying that he's a clown. This was the French reaction to him. So they call him the king of the Jews sarcastically, both because this is what Herod refers to Jesus as derisively, and then they're also doing this because, look at this clown who called himself the king of the Jews. Look how he's fallen. But at the same time, millennialism increases because Christians were just as interested in this guy as others were. So their sense of millennialism increases, particularly in Protestant regions and in the West, in England, particularly, as the English expulsion is starting to fall away and the English Civil War is coming to an end and Jews are being allowed back in. Puritans are encountering some of these ideas, and they develop a preoccupation with Judaism and a preoccupation with the notion of the Israelites returning to God's land. And as they come across on the Mayflower and other ships, they conceive of themselves as the new Israelites. They are the chosen people, and they bring this idea of chosenness and exceptionalism to this new land, and they see this new land that they're going to as a type of new promised land where the Messianic Christian era will happen. And that notion definitely takes hold in this place that will become the United States. And it happens from encounters between Shabtai Zvi's followers and the Puritans, which happens in England. And then finally, the Jewish reactions, immense dismay and disillusionment. But from that, it leads to other religious, political, and social movements. So Shabtai Zvi popularizes mysticism. And so mysticism is brought from Svat into Europe, and the Baal Shem Tov, a few generations later, will take on this mystical mantle, and Hasidism will be born out of this. And the early Hasidic Jews, following the Baal Shem Tov, and then later Hasidic dynasties, they will be accused by what are called the Mitnagim, which are the non-Hasidic Orthodox. They'll be accused of being Sabbateans. They'll say, "You Hasidic Jews, you're Sabbateans. You're followers of Shabtai Zvi," right? There are other new religious movements that I'm going to talk about a little bit later in the class, one called Frankism, which is also this sort of, if Shabtai Zvi ends up leaning towards Islam, Jacob Frank is another Messiah figure who leans towards Christianity. And then, but I think the most important movement that comes out of this is the Haskalah, which is the Jewish Enlightenment, and the Reform movement specifically. Now, you say, what does the Reform movement have to do with Shabtai Zvi, especially because the Reform movement emerges, the earliest form of it emerges at least 150 years later. You have many, many Jews throughout Europe who are like, this is complete nonsense. What are we waiting for? This is complete nonsense. There is no Messiah. It's all a joke. Why are we following the Torah like this? Why are we sticking to these rules when it has gotten us nowhere? We need to come up with a new way of thinking about how we are Jews. And that will end up resulting in the Haskalah, which gives birth to the Reform movement in Germany. Right? So the whole Jewish world is changed by Shabtai Zvi. Nobody is left untouched. Now, I want to end by speaking about the Donma really quickly. These are those initial converts and their descendants, those who converted to Islam and followed Shabtai Zvi. They end up practicing a hybrid of Islam and Judaism. So very similar to the Anusim or the Conversos, who end up practicing a hybrid of some form of Roman Catholicism and Sephardic Judaism. The Donma, maybe a little more openly, practice this sort of hybrid form of Islam and Judaism. They align very, very closely with the Young Turks movement in the and in the aftermath of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of Turkish nationalism, which means that they also aligned themselves with the Turkish genocide against against Armenians, which is really sort of horrendous. Not just sort of horrendous, very horrendous. There are very few of them around today, a small handful, a few hundred descendants of those followers of Shabtai Zvi.
In Turkey.
In Turkey, yes. Primarily in Izmir and a few in Istanbul. Yeah. Okay. I will go ahead and stop the share. In our last few minutes, any questions?
You know, yeah, observation, talk about the end of modern secular Turkey.
Mhm.
Turkey's now seeming to be reverting back to a more Islamic state than it used to be.
Yeah, I think that Erdogan, the question was, has Turkey become, the Young Turks were very secular and Ataturk was very secular, and Erdogan seems to be moving, I would say, less towards like Wahhabi Islam, like a very like strong Islamist bent, and more to sort of seeing Turkey as the inheritor of the Ottoman Empire. And in order to do that, it needs to be explicitly Muslim. In a similar way to which Vladimir Putin basically like says that aligns Russian nationalism with Eastern Russian Orthodoxy. Yeah. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and end it there. Next week we will be back talking about Messianic Judaism in America. But thank you for this really fascinating detour into Jewish history. Messianism has always been around in various forms, and it was fun to talk about that. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone online.